In the autumn of 1887, the vast tabletop landscape of Pembina County in the Dakota Territory was a study in relentless preparation. The air, already carrying the sharp promise of winter, smelled of cold earth and curing wood. Settlers, having wrested a brief and bountiful summer from the unforgiving soil, now turned their full attention to the coming siege of cold. The great enemy was not the soil, but the sky, a sky that could turn from a placid high blue to a churning white fury in less time than it took to call the children indoors. Across the county, the rhythmic clang of hammers and the rasp of saws echoed a single, unified purpose: to build a fortress against the wind and the snow. The accepted design was a matter of settled fact, a piece of architectural gospel carried west from the forested hills of Ohio and Pennsylvania. Cabins rose with proud, steep-roofed ambition. Their walls were tall, their peaks sharp, designed to shed the snow as quickly as it fell. A high ceiling was considered a mark of prosperity, a space for the heat and smoke to rise, a testament to having enough wood to burn that you could afford to heat the empty air above your head. Neighbors helped neighbors in communal cabin raisings, and the structures that resulted were nearly identical, standing like a small, defiant regiment of wooden soldiers against the immense, empty horizon. They were sturdy, they were traditional, and everyone knew they worked. Everyone, that is, except for Lars Halvorsen. A recent arrival, a quiet Norwegian with pale eyes that seemed to hold the memory of glaciers, Lars was building something else entirely. On his quarter section of land, a structure was taking shape that baffled and amused his neighbors in equal measure. While their cabins reached for the sky, Lars's home hugged the earth. He had dug his foundation down, so the floor of his single room was nearly 3 feet below the level of the prairie grass. The north and west walls were not tall log ramparts, but low, stout barriers against which he was already piling and tamping down massive berms of earth. But the most peculiar feature, the one that drew chuckles and headshakes from riders passing on the nearby track, was the roof. It was a vast, low-slung thing. Instead of a sharp snow-shedding peak, it had a gentle, almost lazy slope. And on its 2 longest sides, the north and the west, it did not stop at the eaves. It kept going, sloping down and down until the thick sod shingles nearly touched the ground. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. "He's building more roof than house," muttered Jedediah Thorne, a respected farmer whose own cabin stood as a perfect model of the conventional style. Thorne, a man whose opinions were as solid and square as his hands, saw Lars's project as an affront to common sense. "That low roof will catch the snow, not shed it," he declared to a group of men at the local supply post. "The weight will crush him by January. And burying his walls in dirt, he's inviting the rot and the damp right into his house. It's unnatural." The others nodded in agreement. The structure looked less like a home and more like a strange, grassy mound, a premature burial mound on the open prairie. They called it Halvorsen's Folly. Some, more cruelly, called it the sod-hugger's burrow. This communal mockery would have been a mere footnote in the county's history, a piece of local color about a peculiar immigrant, had it not been for the events that were to follow. For churning in the far north, a meteorological titan was gathering its strength. History would come to know it as the schoolhouse blizzard, the Great Blizzard of 1888. It was a storm of unprecedented ferocity, a maelstrom of ice and wind that would sweep down the plains with the speed of an express train, catching thousands unprepared. In the aftermath of that terrible storm, When the wind finally fell silent and the survivors emerged into a world remade in crystalline white, the laughter directed at Lars Halvorsson's strange house would die in their throats. While their own proud, tall cabins stood battered, their fuel buried, their interiors rimed with frost, Lars's earthen home would be an island of impossible warmth and safety. The foolish burrow would become an ark. What did this quiet Norwegian understand about the physics of wind, snow, and the very air itself that everyone else, in their shared and confident wisdom, had dismissed as utter foolishness? Lars Halvorsson's knowledge was not born in a laboratory or read from a book of engineering. It was a deeper knowledge, etched into his memory by the landscape of his birth. He hailed from a remote valley near Røros, a copper mining town in central Norway, a place where winter was not a season, but the default state of the world. There, survival was a science passed down through generations, a practical wisdom dictated by the crushing reality of 10-foot snowfalls and winds that could strip the warmth from a man's body in minutes. He remembered the cedar, the small summer mountain farms, where the cabins were built low and sturdy, often nestled into the leeward side of a hill. They were not designed to fight the wind, but to deflect it, to let it flow over them like water over a smooth stone. More vividly, he remembered the ancient Jordgammer, the earth-sheltered huts used by Sami reindeer herders and early Norse farmers. These were primal structures, little more than a sturdy wooden frame covered in layers of birch bark, peat, and thick sod, all but invisible against the tundra. He had seen them withstand blizzards that would have torn a modern framed house to splinters. The principle was simple and profound. The greatest insulators were the elements themselves. A thick blanket of earth moderated the temperature, holding the deep geothermal warmth in winter and keeping the structure cool in summer. And a thick, heavy blanket of snow, far from being a dangerous weight to be shed, was a gift. The air trapped within the snow crystals made it one of the most effective insulators known to man. In Norway, they did not fear the snow that buried their homes. They welcomed it. This ancestral memory was sharpened by practical experience in his new country. Before staking his claim in the Dakota Territory, Lars had spent 2 winters in Minneapolis, earning money by working in the city's burgeoning ice harvesting industry. He had helped build the massive ice houses along the Mississippi River, cavernous structures designed to keep thousands of tons of frozen water solid through the heat of July. There, he learned the science of insulation in a new context. He saw how a double wall, with the space between packed tight with sawdust and wood shavings, could create a formidable barrier to heat transfer. The air trapped in the sawdust was the key. They called it dead air, and space where convection could not occur, where heat struggled to move from the warm side to the cold. He packed sawdust for months, feeling the stark temperature difference between the inner and outer walls, and the lesson solidified in his mind. An unmoving layer of air was a wall against the cold. The final piece of his unique architectural puzzle came not from Europe or the city, but from the land itself. In his first months on the prairie, Lars had taken time to observe, to walk the land not as a conqueror, but as a student. He had seen the subtle depressions where the buffalo had once wallowed, and noticed how the snow gathered there, protecting the grass beneath. He had encountered an old Cree hunter, a man named Chayton, who had shared a piece of wisdom while they sheltered from an autumn squall. Chayton, pointing with his chin at the way the wind whipped around a sharp rock outcropping, had said in broken English, "Wind is a river, fast and strong. A tall wall makes it angry. It pushes, It screams. A low hill. The river flows past. It gives the hill a coat of snow to keep it warm. The image of an angry river striking a wall versus a calm one flowing over a hill became a central tenet of Lars's design. He saw the same principle in the abandoned semi-subterranean earth lodges of the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples further down the Missouri River. They were round and low, built to present the smallest possible obstacle to the prairie wind, their earthen roofs designed to host a living blanket of grass in the summer and a thick coat of insulating snow in the winter. Lars Halvorsen was not merely copying a Norwegian hut or a Mandan lodge. He was synthesizing a lifetime of observation into a single, cohesive system. His house would use the earth-berming and sod roof of his homeland, the dead air insulation principles from the Minneapolis ice houses, and the aerodynamic, wind-deflecting shape inspired by the wisdom of the prairie's original inhabitants. The narrator of this story, the silent voice of physics, can now explain the science that Lars understood intuitively. The low, gentle slope of his roof, what an engineer would call a low angle of attack, was designed to keep the airflow laminar, or smooth. A steep roof, like Jedediah Thorne's, creates turbulence. The wind accelerates as it goes over the peak, forming a low-pressure zone on the leeward side, a phenomenon known as the Bernoulli effect. This low-pressure zone acts like a giant suction cup, constantly pulling warm air out of the house through every tiny crack and chink in the construction. Lars's roof, by contrast, minimized this effect. The wind flowed over it without creating that heat-sucking vortex. Furthermore, the design was not meant to shed snow, but to capture it. The gentle slope, the texture of the sod shingles, and the way the roofline blended into the surrounding landscape were all calculated to slow the wind just enough for it to deposit its load of snow. As the snow piled up, burying the roof and the earth-bermed walls, the house would effectively disappear into a massive, custom-fitted drift. A foot of fresh, powdery snow has an insulating R value of about R10, equivalent to more than 3 inches of modern fiberglass insulation. A 4-foot drift would provide an R value of R40, a level of insulation unheard of at the time, and respectable even by today's standards. The earth berms served a dual purpose. They blocked the wind and provided insulation, but they also acted as a thermal mass. The sheer tonnage of soil would absorb the faint heat of the winter sun during the day, and, more importantly, would act as a buffer, slowing the escape of heat from the cabin's interior during the long, frigid nights. It was a complete, integrated system, where every element worked in concert with the unforgiving Dakota environment, rather than in opposition to it. The construction process throughout that autumn was a slow, deliberate affair, a public spectacle of what the community considered Lars's folly. He began not by raising walls, but by digging. With a simple spade and wheelbarrow, he excavated a rectangle 30 feet long and 18 feet wide to a depth of 3 feet. This was back-breaking work, and Jedediah Thorne, stopping by on his wagon, couldn't resist a comment. "Starting a root cellar, Halvorsen?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "A mighty big one for a man living alone." Lars simply wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded. "A good foundation," he said, his English still thick with the cadence of his native tongue. He was not just digging a hole. He was creating a thermal buffer zone, placing the living space of his home below the frost line, where the Earth's temperature remained relatively stable year-round. Next came the walls. For the shorter east and west ends of the rectangle, he laid a foundation of flat fieldstones and then began to raise stout log walls, carefully notching and fitting the timbers. These were the only two walls that would be fully exposed to the elements. For the long north and south walls, he built much lower, only about 4 feet high from the excavated floor. These were the walls that would support the great sloping roof and would be buried by the earthen berms. He used the thickest logs for this, knowing they would have to bear not just the weight of the roof, but the immense lateral pressure of the packed earth. The roof itself was an engineering marvel of practical, heavy-duty carpentry. He first placed a massive ridgepole, a single straight pine he had traded 3 months' labor to acquire, down the center of the structure. From this backbone, he ran rafters of milled lumber, not thin sticks, but thick 6-inch beams, down to the log walls. He placed them close together, only 16 inches apart, a spacing that his neighbors deemed absurdly excessive. "You could drive a loaded wagon over that roof," another farmer commented, laughing. That was precisely the point. Lars was building not for the weight of wood and sod, but for the potential weight of 4 feet of wet, heavy snow. Over the rafters, he laid down a solid deck of thick planks. On top of this, he painstakingly layered sheets of tar paper, overlapping each one and sealing the seams with hot pitch. This was his barrier against the dampness Jedediah Thorne had predicted. He understood that insulation was useless if it was wet. Then came the most laborious part. Using a block and tackle rigged to a temporary gin pole, he began hauling up squares of prairie sod he had cut earlier in the summer. These were not thin, decorative pieces. They were thick, 18-inch squares with the dense, tangled root structure of the native grasses still intact. He laid them in 2 overlapping layers, like giant shingles, packing them tightly together. The final structure was less a roof and more of a landscaped hill, seamlessly integrated into the berms he had built against the north and west walls. Inside, the logic was just as clear. The ceiling was low, only 6 feet and 10 inches from the packed earth floor. This was a direct refutation of the local fashion for high ceilings. Lars knew that every cubic foot of air in a house was a cubic foot that had to be heated. A low ceiling reduced the total volume dramatically, meaning his small cast iron stove could heat the space more quickly and efficiently. He placed the stove in the exact center of the room, allowing its radiant heat to spread evenly in all directions. The windows were small, no larger than 2 feet square, and placed only on the east and south walls to catch the morning and midday sun. Each was fitted not only with glass, but with a thick, insulated wooden shutter that could be bolted shut from the inside, effectively turning the window into an insulated wall during the night or a storm. Jedediah Thorne made one final visit near the end of the construction, acting as the self-appointed voice of community reason. He walked around the strange, low structure, his boots scuffing against the earthen berms. "Halverson," he began, his tone that of a man offering a final chance at redemption. "It's not too late to fix this. You've wasted a good deal of lumber on that roof, but the walls are still salvageable. Tear that thing off, build the walls up proper, and put on a decent peak. We'll even come and help you raise it right." He gestured to his own cabin, visible a half-mile away, its sharp roof a proud black triangle against the pale sky. "That's how a man builds a house in this country. High and dry, shed the weather, don't invite it in for a permanent stay." Lars, who was busy fitting the heavy oak door, paused his work. He looked at Thorne, then at the vast, empty prairie that stretched to the horizon, and then at the sky. He knew what that sky was capable of. He understood the wind not as a nuisance, but as a relentless, energy-sapping force. He understood the snow not as a picturesque blanket, but as a building material. His response was quiet, but firm. "My house is for the winter, Mr. Thorne. Your house is for the summer." Thorne scoffed, shaking his head as he turned to leave. "We'll see whose house is standing come spring," he called back over his shoulder. The mockery continued, but it was tinged now with a finality. The fool had finished his folly. All that was left was for winter to arrive and teach him its harsh and inevitable lesson. Lars ignored them all. He continued his work, methodically chinking the last gaps in his log walls with a mixture of moss and clay, his confidence as solid and silent as the earth he had piled against his home. Winter arrived not as a gradual decline, but as an assault. The first few snows of November and December were manageable, and for a time it seemed the skeptics might be right. The snow did not slide off Lars's roof. It collected there, a growing blanket of white that made his house look even more like a natural feature of the landscape. But the great test began on the afternoon of January 12th, 1888. The day had started with an unnerving mildness, a false spring that lured farmers out to their fields and children to their schools without their heaviest coats. But in the early afternoon, the sky to the northwest turned a terrifying, bruised purple. The temperature plummeted. It did not drop. It fell as if a switch had been thrown, from a mild 34 degrees Fahrenheit to 10 below zero in a matter of 3 hours. Then the wind came. It was not a gale. It was a physical presence, a solid wall of moving air that screamed across the featureless prairie at over 60 miles per hour. With it came the snow, but it was not the fluffy, picturesque flakes of a Christmas card. It was a fine, granular ice, like sand, that the wind picked up from the ground and hurled horizontally with the force of a sandblaster. Visibility dropped to zero. A man could not see his own hand in front of his face. The world beyond a person's walls ceased to exist, replaced by a deafening, white roar. This was the schoolhouse blizzard, a storm that earned its name from the scores of children and teachers who would perish trying to walk home from their one-room schools, often freezing to death only yards from their own front doors. Inside Jedediah Thorne's proper cabin, the battle for survival began immediately. The house, which had felt so sturdy and proud in the calm autumn air, now seemed fragile and porous. The wind hammered the tall, flat north wall with the force of a battering ram. The entire structure groaned and shuddered with each gust. The high-peaked roof, designed to shed snow, did its job with brutal efficiency on the windward side, leaving the wooden shingles exposed to the full, murderous cold of the wind chill, which approached 70 degrees below zero. Every nail in the structure seemed to shriek in protest as the wood contracted in the sudden, abyssal cold. The greatest failure was the very design that was supposed to be its strength. The steep roof created the exact low-pressure vortex that Lars had sought to avoid. A constant, invisible suction pulled at the house, drawing precious warm air out through the chimney, through the gaps around the window frames, and even through the chinking between the logs. Drafts, which had been minor annoyances before, became icy, cutting jets of air. Thorne's wife, Mary, stuffed rags and newspapers into every crack she could find, but it was a losing battle. The cold was not just outside, it was an invading army. The high ceiling became their enemy, a vast, unreachable reservoir of any heat their stove could produce. The family huddled together on the floor, as far from the walls as possible, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The stove glowed red-hot, devouring the seasoned oak they had stacked so carefully, but its heat was immediately stolen, rising to the frigid stratosphere of their ceiling and then being sucked away into the storm. Their woodpile, located just outside the back door on the leeward side, was now buried under a monstrous snowdrift, a 12-foot mountain of densely packed snow that had been dumped there by the turbulent wind curling over their roof. By the second day, Thorne was forced to break up a wooden chair for fuel, the sharp crack of the joinery a sound of pure desperation. Less than a half-mile away, the scene inside Halverson's Folly was one of surreal tranquility. When the storm had hit, Lars had calmly bolted his insulated shutters, lit his small stove, and settled in. The first thing he noticed was the sound. He could hear the high-pitched shriek of the wind, but it was a distant, muffled sound, as if it were happening in another world. There was no groaning timber, no shuddering walls. His low, aerodynamic structure was not fighting the wind. It was letting the river of air flow over it. The sod and the heavy timbers absorbed what little vibration there was, creating a profound sense of solidity and stillness. His greatest ally, as he had planned, was the storm itself. The wind, flowing smoothly over his roof, slowed just enough to drop its immense load of snow. Within hours, the fine, dense powder began to pile up against the north and west roof slopes, which reached nearly to the ground. The snow filled in the gap between the roof edge and the prairie, then climbed the roof itself. By the morning of the second day, Lars's house had vanished from the landscape. It was completely entombed within a massive, perfectly sculpted snowdrift. He was living inside an igloo, insulated by the very fury that was tearing his neighbor's world apart. The earth-bermed walls, protected from the wind and moderated by the planet's geothermal heat, radiated a steady, subtle warmth. His stove required only a single, small log every few hours. The heat it produced had nowhere to go. Trapped by the low ceiling, the insulated walls, and the massive blanket of snow above, it created a small, stable bubble of warmth. The air was not hot, but it was comfortable. It was survivable. On the third day of the blizzard, with the wind still howling unabated, Lars Halvorsen engaged in a quiet, methodical act of vindication. He lit a tallow candle and unbolted the shutter on his south-facing window. The world outside was an incomprehensible, moving wall of white. He held his German-made mercury thermometer just outside the thick glass pane for a full minute. When he brought it back in, the mercury had sunk to the very bottom of the tube, 42 degrees below zero. He recorded the reading in a small leather-bound ledger with a piece of charcoal. Then, he hung the same thermometer from a rafter in the center of his room. He waited 5 minutes, watching the mercury climb steadily. The final reading, 56 degrees above zero, a temperature differential of nearly 100 degrees. He noted this in his ledger as well. Finally, he made a small mark on the wall to indicate the number of logs he had burned in the past 24 hours. 5. He performed a smoke test, holding a smoldering wick near the door and window frames. The thin ribbon of smoke rose straight up, unperturbed. There were no drafts. The data was clear, objective, and irrefutable. His system worked. That evening, above the muffled roar of the wind, he heard a new sound. It was a frantic, desperate banging on his heavy oak door. He took a moment to light a lantern, his movements calm and deliberate. When he pulled back the heavy iron bolt and opened the door, a figure stumbled in, collapsing to the floor in a cloud of fine snow. It was Jedediah Thorne. His face was a mask of ice, his beard frozen solid. His eyes, wide with fear and desperation, darted around the calm, warm room, unable to comprehend the scene. My family," he stammered, his lips cracked and blue. "The fire is out. We burned the last of the kitchen table. Mary, the baby, they're so cold." He was a man utterly broken, stripped of his pride and his certainty, reduced to a primal plea for help. Lars helped him to a stool near the stove and gave him a cup of hot broth he had been simmering. Thorne's hands shook so violently he could barely hold it. He drank it down, the warmth spreading through his chest, and his eyes began to clear. He looked at the small, placid fire in Lars's stove, then at Lars's modest woodpile, which was still nearly full. He looked at the calm, quiet interior, felt the absolute stillness of the air, the absence of the knife-like drafts that had tormented his own family for 3 days. The sheer cognitive dissonance of the scene was overwhelming. His own sturdy, well-built home was a frozen tomb. This foolish, half-buried burrow was a sanctuary. Finally, the question that had been screaming in his mind escaped his lips, no longer a challenge, but a whisper of awe and surrender. How? Lars Halvorsen did not smile. There was no hint of triumph or self-congratulation in his expression. He was a practical man, and the moment called for practicality, not pride. He simply pointed a finger toward the low ceiling. "Snow," he said. The single word hung in the air, thick with meaning. He then gestured to the solid, earth-packed walls. "Earth." He picked up another small log and placed it in the stove, the gesture itself a demonstration of the structure's incredible efficiency. There was no need for a lecture. The reality of the warm, safe room was the only explanation necessary. Lars then pulled on his heavy coat and, without another word, followed Thorne back out into the blinding fury of the storm to rescue his family, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder to ensure they did not get lost in the 20-foot journey from his door to the edge of the drift. When the great blizzard finally blew itself out, the silence it left behind was as profound as the noise had been. The sun rose on a world transformed, a landscape of dazzling sculpted white. The devastation was immense. Livestock had frozen standing in the fields. Scores of people were dead. Many of the proud, tall cabins had been battered, their windows blown out, their contents frozen solid. The Thorne family, and 2 others Lars had managed to shelter, had survived. When Jedediah Thorne returned to his own cabin, he found the water in the bucket beside the dead stove, frozen into a solid, glass-thick block of ice. The ink in his inkwell was a black starburst of ice crystals. The contrast with the gentle warmth of Lars's home was the final, irrefutable proof. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the recovering community. The story of how Thorne and his family had been saved in Halvorsen's Folly became the dominant topic of conversation. The mockery was replaced by a quiet, grudging respect, which soon blossomed into genuine curiosity. Thorne himself became Lars's most vocal advocate. He publicly, and with great humility, described the failure of his own house and the stunning success of Lars's. "We thought he was a fool for hugging the earth," Thorne told a gathering at the supply post. "Turns out, we were the fools for trying to fight the sky." A few weeks later, Thorne, accompanied by a half-dozen other farmers, appeared at Lars's door. They did not carry tools for a communal raising or smirks of derision. They carried notebooks and pencils. "Mr. Halverson," Thorne said, his hat in his hands, "would you be willing to teach us?" Lars, a man of few words but deep patience, agreed. He did not lecture. He demonstrated. He took them inside his house, letting them feel the lingering, even warmth. He used a piece of charcoal on a wide pine board to sketch the design. He drew the deep foundation, the low, earth-bermed walls, and the gentle slope of the great roof. He explained the importance of the close-set rafters for bearing the load of the snow. "Snow is not the enemy," he explained, tapping the drawing of the roof. "Snow is the blanket. You do not throw away a blanket in winter." He showed them the tar paper barrier, explaining how to keep the dampness of the sod from the wood. He demonstrated how the low ceiling kept the heat where it was needed. He answered their practical questions with simple, direct answers, translating his intuitive, ancestral knowledge into a language these farmers could understand. That summer, a new kind of construction began on the Dakota Prairie. All across Pembina County, families began retrofitting their homes or building new ones based on Lars's principles. They called them Halverson houses, or more simply, snow catchers. Some dug down and bermed their existing cabins. Others, building anew, copied his design almost exactly. They adapted the model to their own resources, some using fieldstone for the bermed walls instead of logs. Others experimenting with layers of straw beneath the sod for extra insulation. The core principles, the low profile, the earth sheltering, and the snow-collecting roof, were universally adopted by those who had seen the proof firsthand. The following winter was another harsh one, but this time there was no crisis. The results were immediate and dramatic. Families who had adopted Lars's designs reported burning less than half the firewood they had used in previous years. Their homes were warmer, free of the life-sapping drafts that had once been a constant feature of winter. The local doctor, a man named Arbuthnot, noted in his journal a significant decrease in cases of pneumonia and other respiratory illnesses, particularly among the very young and the elderly. The babies born that year thrived, and the old folks survived. The community was not just more comfortable, it was more resilient, better equipped to handle the brutal realities of the environment they had chosen to call home. Lars Halverson, the quiet outcast, had become the respected source of survival knowledge, his folly, the new standard of practical wisdom. The innovation did not remain confined to Pembina County. The local school teacher, a young woman named Eleanor Vance, who had been one of the curious observers of Lars's construction, had spent the blizzard huddled with her students in the schoolhouse, an experience that had nearly claimed their lives. Deeply impressed by Lars's design, she wrote a long, detailed letter to her brother, an editor for a popular agricultural journal, the Dakota Farmer. She described the blizzard, the failure of the conventional cabins, and the remarkable success of the Norwegian snow house. Her letter, edited and published as an article, captured the imagination of farmers and homesteaders across the northern plains. The principles of the Halverson House began to spread, appearing in building plans and government bulletins for settlers in Montana, Wyoming, and the Canadian prairies. It was a piece of folk knowledge entering the written record, a testament to a solution born of necessity and observation. Modern building science would eventually validate every single one of Lars Halverson's intuitive choices. His snow-collecting roof was a brilliant, passive system for achieving a high R value, the standard measure of thermal resistance. A 4-foot layer of packed snow, which his roof could easily support, provides an R value of over R40, a target that modern, energy-efficient homes strive for with expensive foam and fiberglass insulation. His use of earthen berms is now recognized as a highly effective technique for leveraging thermal mass, a cornerstone of passive solar design that helps regulate interior temperatures with minimal energy input. The aerodynamic shape of his home, designed to minimize wind load and prevent heat-sucking pressure differentials, is a principle that now informs the design of skyscrapers and research stations in Antarctica. His focus on a compact, well-sealed building envelope with minimal volume and strategically placed windows is the very definition of a modern, super-insulated structure. He was, without any formal training, a pioneer of sustainable architecture. The story of Lars Halvorsen and his ground-touching roof is more than a historical curiosity. It is a parable about the nature of wisdom. In a world that often prizes theoretical knowledge and dismisses tradition as outdated, his story stands as a powerful reminder of the value of practical, lived experience. The established community, confident in their conventional methods, saw only what was strange and different. They laughed at what they did not understand. Lars, in contrast, possessed a deeper understanding, one drawn from generations of ancestors who had learned to listen to the wind and cooperate with the winter rather than defy it. His knowledge was humble, quiet, and profoundly effective. He survived and helped others survive, not through arrogance, but through a deep respect for the powerful forces of the natural world. In the end, the fields of Pembina County were dotted with low, earth-hugging homes, their gentle, sod-covered roofs waiting patiently for the gift of the winter snow. The laughter had long since faded, replaced by the quiet hum of life, persisting and thriving against the odds. On the vast, wind-swept canvas of the Dakota prairie, Lars Halvorsen had not built a wall to fight the winter. He had built a vessel to sail through it, insulated by the very storm he sought to survive.